You, Isaiah. I'd like to begin my remarks today where I left off on Rosh Hashanah, and I'm quoting from the very end of that sermon. Because of our diverse, multiracial nature, Jews must necessarily embrace anti-racism as a sacred value. The Jewish diaspora is a microcosm of the world we seek to create. If the term Ahavat Yisrael means love of your fellow Jew, it must also affirm the love that crosses all lines and borders and boundaries. Jews must embrace anti-racism as a sacred value. It must be a mitzvah, if you will. At Tzedek Chicago, we've actually articulated this as one of our congregation's core values. If you go to our website, you will read, quote, "We promote a Judaism rooted in anti-racist values and understand that anti-Semitism is not separate from the systems that perpetuate prejudice and discrimination." Like all of our other values, this one has very practical implications. It will necessarily guide the choices we make as a community, the issues we work on, the groups we stand with, the public statements we make. And in general, it will mean we must always foreground this question: what does it mean as a Jewish congregation or a Jewish community to observe anti-racism as a sacred value? I'm sure most liberal Jews wouldn't find this question all that controversial. After all, American Jewry has a long and venerable history of standing up for racial equality, particularly when it comes to our participation in the civil rights movement. But I would suggest that this question presents an important challenge to the Jewish community of the 21st century. And it was actually put to the test this past summer when the Movement for Black Lives released their policy statement, Vision for Black Lives. I know that many of you are very familiar with Movement for Black Lives. It is a coalition of over 50 organizations from around the country that focus on issues of concern to the Black community. 1 year ago, their policy table began an extensive process convening national and local groups and engaging with researchers and community members. This summer, they published their Vision for Black Lives, a comprehensive policy platform that focuses on 6 main areas: ending the war on Black people, reparations, invest, divest, economic justice, community control, and political power. I will say unabashedly that I find the Vision for Black Lives platform to be one of the most important American policy statements of our time. It's both an unflinching analysis of the institutional racism against Black people in this country, as well as a smart policy statement about what can be done, and in some cases what is already being done, to dismantle it. What makes Vision for Black Lives particularly unique is that it wasn't produced by the usual method. That is to say, it wasn't created by a think tank or special interest group. Rather, it was developed by a coalition of national grassroots organizations that reflect the communities most directly affected by these particular issues. And in the end, it serves as both an ideological manifesto as well as a practical, hard-nosed policy statement that lays out a legislative path toward achieving very specific goals. In so doing, as many have observed, it is moving Black Lives Matter from a structureless network of local organizations toward becoming a genuine political movement in our country. I'll quote from their introduction. "We want this platform to be both a visionary agenda for our people and a resource for us. We take as a departure point the reality that by every metric, from the hue of its prison population to its investment choices, the US is a country that does not support, protect, or preserve Black life. And so we seek not reform, but transformation. Our hope is that this is both an articulation of our collective aspirations as well as a document that provides tangible resources for groups and individuals doing the work. We recognize that some of the demands in this document will not happen today, but we also recognize that they are necessary for our liberation." This platform is also very notable, very important, because it doesn't limit its concern to issues facing the American Black community alone. It understands that the systemic racism impacting people of color in this country is but a part of many interlocking systems of oppression that affect the lives of communities the world over. As the platform puts it, quote, "We are a collective that centers and is rooted in Black communities, but we recognize we have a shared struggle with all oppressed people. Collective liberation will be a product of all our work," end quote. If you haven't read Vision for Black Lives yet, I highly recommend it. I'll warn you, it's not easy, it's very long, and it's heavily referenced, so really reading it and integrating it will take commitment. I've read it 3 times now, and each time I've discovered something new and challenging that I hadn't seen before. But in the end, I found it profoundly inspiring, and that is not something you often say about policy platforms. I would go as far as to say it's a prophetic document. As I quoted earlier, it seeks not reform, but transformation. And if you want the definition of prophetic, the words that we just heard from Isaiah were about transformation and not reform. Like me, I'm sure many of you have read innumerable books and articles that analyze institutional racism and the way it's inflicted on people of color in this country. Usually when we read them, they leave us pent up with frustration or a sense of hopelessness. The problem is just so vast and pervasive. How on earth can we ever hope to dismantle it? But this is the first time I've read such an analysis along with an extensive prescription or prescriptions toward political solutions. It's not pie in the sky, as the report says. And I'm quoting now, "We recognize that some of the demands in this document will not happen today, but we also recognize that they are necessary for our liberation." When I read this, I can't help but recall the famous ancient dictum by Rabbi Tarfon. "It is not up to you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it." What would it mean for a Jewish community to observe anti-racism as a sacred value? I think one important test would be its response to the release of the Vision for Black Lives platform. And in this regard, I'm sorry to say that the American Jewish establishment has failed this test miserably. Almost immediately after it's released, just a day or 2 after its release, every mainstream Jewish organization responded with statements that ranged from critical to outright hostility. Why? Because in the Invest, Divest section, there is one section that advocates diverting financial resources away from military expenditures and investing in domestic infrastructure and community well-being. And in that section, there were some brief references to Israel. One that referred to, quote, "the genocide taking place against the Palestinian people," and another that called Israel an apartheid state. And as you might expect from a section entitled Invest, Divest, there was a statement of solidarity with the nonviolent Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. The first official Jewish response to Vision for Black Lives came from the Boston Jewish Community Relations Council just 2 days after it was released. The Boston JCRC said it was, quote, "deeply dismayed by the report," denounced the use of the word genocide and its support for BDS. It had nothing more to say about this voluminous, wide-ranging platform. It spent 7 paragraphs on this one issue, and most of that was devoted to this one word. Over the next few weeks, one Jewish organization after another denounced the platform for its statements about Israel, with only a glancing nod to its analysis, its conclusions, and its policy recommendations. Jonathan Greenblatt, the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, called its reference to Israel, quote, "repellent," and added patronizingly, let's work to keep our eyes on the prize." Even Jewish liberal organizations such as J Street, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and Trua, an American rabbinical organization devoted to human rights, responded with criticism and chastisement. These responses tell us all we need to know about the Jewish communal establishment and its commitment to the value of anti-racism. But it really shouldn't come as a surprise. The Jewish institutional community hasn't been in real solidarity with Black Americans and people of color for decades. Most of what we call solidarity is Jews are white, but it is actually a subject of debate, at least among white Jews. In fact, it's become something of a cottage industry. If you doubt me, just Google, "Are Jews white?" and see how many hits you get. There's actually a very simple way to answer this question. Ask a Jew of color. Let Lina Morales, a Mexican-American Jew who recently wrote a powerful article on the subject, explain it to you, and I'm quoting her now. "With all due respect to my white Jewish friends and colleagues, people of color in the United States don't need to take a course on critical race theory to understand the nuances of race. Anti-Semitism exists, and I've received a fair amount of it from fellow people of color. But its impact and extent doesn't compare to the systemic racism of American society. White Jews simply don't face the criminalization that black and brown people do in this country. They are not locked up or deported in record numbers, nor is their demographic growth or struggle not to be capriciously murdered by police considered a threat by a large and reactionary part of our population." End quote. I should mention that thankfully, there were some Jewish organizations that did in fact welcome and endorse Vision for Black Lives. Not surprisingly, all of them came from outside the Jewish institutional establishment. Organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, and Jews for Economic and Racial Justice in New York. For me, the most trenchant and powerful response came from the Jews of Color Caucus, which works in partnership with JVP. Among the many important points made in their statement was this one that was sent directly to the Jewish communal establishment. I'm quoting again. "Recent statements by the Boston JCRC, TRUA, the Rabbinical Council for Human Rights, and the Union for Reform Judaism condemning the BLM platform also send the message that the lives of black Jews, along with black Gentiles, directly affected by US police brutality, are less important than protecting Israel from scrutiny. We reject this message and call on these groups to commit themselves to honor the leadership of Jews of color, including those critical of Israel. We are appalled at the action of the white US institutional Jewish community in detracting and distracting from such a vital platform at a time when black lives are on the line simply because the organizers chose to align their struggle with the plight of Palestinians. US black relationships to Palestine and Israel have never been monolithic, but there are deep historical ties between black and Palestinian struggle that go back to the Black Power era. Any attempt to co-opt black struggle while demeaning these connections is an act of anti-black erasure." End quote. Their reference to the Black Power movement of the late 1960s is critically important here. This marks the time in which white Jews were leaving cities for the suburbs to become part of the white majority. And it also marks the time following the Six-Day War, 1967, in which Israel began to become central to American Jewish identity. For many white American Jews, this new relationship between black and Palestinian liberation movements was experienced as a betrayal of former allies. Many American Jews looked to Zionism as the liberation movement of the Jewish people and considered it downright anti-Semitic to claim that Israel was actually a settler colonial project that militarily expelled and displaced indigenous people. Of course, many American Jews still believe this, and that is why the Jewish institutional responses to the Vision for Black Lives resonates with such a strong sense of betrayal. That is why the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt wrote, "We must keep our eyes on the prize." There is this yearning for a coalition that no longer exists, and a refusal to accept, as the Movement for Black Lives does, that Israel is part of this system of oppression. So many otherwise liberal American Jews will insist Israel is different. Don't compare Israel to the racist system that oppresses blacks and people of color in this country. Don't compare Israel to apartheid South Africa or any other state where one ethnic group wields power over another. It's not the same thing. Of course, every country and every nation is different in many ways from one another. But it is time to admit that when it comes to systems of oppression, Israel is not different. And this is precisely the place that so many in the Jewish community, even those who are otherwise progressive in every other way, are simply unwilling to go. To admit that in the end, Israel is, by its very nature, an oppressor state, a system that privileges one ethnic group over another systemically, and that this system is fundamentally connected to a larger system of oppression. In fact, it plays a very integral role in that system. The very same tear gas canisters that are used daily against Palestinians are the ones that were used against protesters in Ferguson. The same security apparatus that is used on the West Bank separation wall is the one that is used on the border wall that the US is building on our southern border with Mexico. The same stun grenades that Israeli soldiers use against demonstrators in Be'in or Nabi Saleh are the same ones used by American SWAT teams in Cincinnati and Oakland and St. Paul. Here in Chicago, as in so many cities around the country, there is a new recognition of how the militarization of police departments is being used in ways that target communities of color. Those who say that we can't compare the systemic racism to Israel should know that the Chicago's Jewish Federation, the JUF, regularly sponsors, quote, police exchange programs, trips that take the CPD to go to Israel to learn the latest military techniques from the IDF. Regarding these exchange programs, the JUF executive VP, Jay Takath, has said this, I'm quoting, "Helping connect and thereby improve the work of both Israeli and Chicago police is a natural role for the JUF, committed as we are to the safety of the entire Chicago community and the Jewish state. From advising us on ways to enhance the physical security of our Jewish community's institutions, to helping us ensure the safety of JUF events, everything from dinners to pro-Israel rallies, we are grateful for the extraordinary commitment of CPD, Cook County's Homeland Security, and Emergency Management, and our other public law enforcement partners. These missions to Israel both reflect and help deepen these valued relationships." So we can't have it both ways. The Jewish establishment cannot simultaneously empower the systems that oppress people of color in this country and at the same time say that we stand in solidarity with Israel. If we are going to be anti-racist, we can't make an exception. Some of us have made it already clear where we stand, but sooner than later, all of us in the Jewish community will have to stop dancing around the issue of racism and make a decision. When it comes to Israel, we cannot continue to cling to a two-state solution that Israel has already made impossible. As I've said before, the real choice we will have to face is a choice between two one-state solutions. One apartheid state in which a Jewish minority rules the non-Jewish majority, or a state where all have equal rights and citizenship, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. But on a still deeper level, we must also reckon with the separatist assumptions that are behind the two-state solution. What are we really doing when we advocate for a Jewish state that must have a demographic majority of Jews in order to exist? The same liberal Jews who cling to the notion of a two-state solution would recoil at the suggestion of solving Jim Crow by separating Black Americans from white Americans, that the only way two peoples living in the same country can coexist is to physically separate them from one another. So to return again to my original question, how can we as Jews embrace anti-racism as a sacred Jewish value? I'd like to offer a few suggestions in conclusion. One, it would mean that the white Jewish establishment must embrace the concept of solidarity. Specifically, that means we cannot make it about us. The objects of oppression are the ones who must dictate the terms of their struggle. If we have issues with how they articulate their vision, we must raise these issues with them face-to-face in genuine partnership, not through public chastisement. Two, it would mean letting go of our reverence of a civil rights era that is long past and take an honest look at our complicity in the current reality in which white Jews are part of a privileged majority. Anti-Semitism does exist in the US today, but it is not institutionally imposed upon us the way it is upon communities of color. Three, it would mean letting go of the old paradigm of Black-Jewish relations. According to some estimates, 10 to 20% of Jews in this country are Jews of color. Estimates of black Jews in the US range from 20,000 to 200,000. And unlike white Jews, Jews of color are impacted by institutional racism. Any new anti-racist paradigm must reject Jewish white supremacy and center the experience of Jews of color. 4, it would mean subjecting Israel to the same analysis we use when it comes to our own country. Israel is not separate from the systems that oppress people of color at home and abroad. We must be willing to identify these connections and call them out as we would any other aspect of institutional racism. Finally, and perhaps most difficult for many, it would mean letting go of a Zionist dream that never really was, to recognize that the Zionist dream was realized on the backs of Palestinians, just as the American dream was realized on the backs of indigenous people and blacks who were brought to this country in chains. Yes, it is painful to give up on dreams, but it is even more painful to hold on to them until they turn into a nightmare for all concerned. After all, on Yom Kippur, we vow to let go of the dreams of what might have been, but have led us down the wrong path. But it is also the day in which we can dream new dreams. We can dream of a world in which systems of exploitation and oppression are no more. As Sarah reminded us last night, we must begin the year by focusing on the end, even if we know that the end will not be the end that we experience in our own lives. To paraphrase the vision for Black Lives, we recognize that some of these dreams will not happen today or even in our lifetime, but we also recognize that they are necessary for our liberation. May we realize this dream b'mehera b'yameinu, speedily in our day, in Omar, and let's say, Amen.